mode things. Okay, so this is the second session, 2230 UTC, 2330 BST. And so, Tizak, times and appropriate greetings. This is the non-text, non-traditional research output research object, birds of a feather or gaggle. And what we are planning to do is let's go on to that there, have a discussion, and after we've set the scene, learn from the people who are here. It's not just a talky thing, and we'll see where we get to on thinking about how we move things forward. So I'll go back a couple of slides now. There you go. Just a few logistic notes. Please make sure you sign in and take notes in the collaborative Google Doc, which the link is in the chat, in the Zoom chat. Discussions are going to be recorded, as you just heard. Please raise your hand if you want to contribute, but feel free to butt in because there's not that many people here. I just put stuff in the chat. This is an RDA session under the RDA guiding principles. And if you somehow feel that there has been a breach in those, documentation for how to do that is at the top of the Google Doc and also in these slides, which I think I've linked into the main doc as well. Okay, and it is a session led by myself and Jenny. So hello. I am Adam Miles Moore, product specialist, persistent identifiers at JISC in the UK. Jenny.
And I am Jenny Evans. I'm Research Environment and Scholarly Communications Lead at the University of Westminster. So I have a combined Research and Knowledge Exchange Office, Library and Archive Service role.
Thank you. And so the general idea is I do 10 minutes of welcome and introduction. Jenny talks about the reason that we're convening this Birds of a Feather. So I look back over how we got to this spot. And then we hear contributions from the other people that are here. Then we think about, we've discussed what we have done already, how we move that work forward, how we perhaps get into open standards, look at kind of like schema and platforms, infrastructure, and also think a bit about policy. And then after that, that should lead us to think about perhaps what the actual concrete next steps we could do are, the action plan, and maybe what we do inside the context of RDA as well. Okay, so what I'll do is we'll go on with the scene setting and the welcome and introduction. And then Andrea, if you get your tech stuff sorted, then we can do some of the collaborative stuff. Otherwise, we'll figure out as we go along. All right, then. So what I'll do next is talk about what the kind of proposal that we made to start this Bird of a Feather. So we talked about we wanted to learn from the communities that create the non-traditional or non-text process and products. So it was not just about NTROs, but about the kind of like actual process, the practice, and capturing all of that and how we kind of like mediate and characterize those things. We wanted to share outcomes and experiences from projects supporting those communities, such as the one that we ourselves done and Jenny talk about next. And then we wanted to have sessions on the standards, and then kind of think about action plan, what we do within the RDA, working group, IG, something like that. So a quick overview. Many research communities create these NTROs. Jenny and myself ran PR Voices. So that was a scoping project funded by HRC. Oh gosh, nearly a whole 2 years ago now. You'd have thought. And so we worked with the practice research community in the UK on a co-production for recommendations for NTRO. And the most important part of that was the co-production bit, and then the actual kind of aim, which is to have this kind of parity so that all of the outputs, the policy, the practice, sorry, not policy, all the outputs, the practice and the process are first-class citizens within the wider kind of global research output, team and infrastructure. So the idea behind the session is to bring together various communities and then to discuss these things and how we move like international capture, storage, discover, and open standards. Again, to give parity, to give it first-class items in the system, and so move away from things being called other. So we had some questions. What are the implications of this kind of stuff over time? The supporting infrastructure, the infrastructure becoming interactive, the loss of a retrospective archive, and mutability as a standard for both the RDA community and how we influence conversations around what has been called open science, which we would very much like to reframe as fair research. And that is where I hand over to Jenny to talk about stuff. And we just check again. And sorry, because you're the only one here. At the moment, just to hear it, you can hear us, and that's all making sense.
I think so. Okay, I'm happy just to get started, shall I?
Yeah.
Yeah,
you can hear.
Yeah, still here. Okay, great. Amazing. Thank you. Reassuring, because Adam and I have talked a lot to each other about this, so we want to make sure that you could also hear us. Okay, so I will share my screen.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I need to stop doing that.
Oh, good. And we feel your pain. Technical issues are just not much fun. Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yes.
Amazing. Okay, I've got this weird presentation thing going on the left-hand side, which is a bit disconcerting. My slides are actually to the right, so apologies if I'm not looking at the screen. So practice research voices. Case study, as Adam's mentioned, this is a scoping project funded by the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council. God, almost 2 years ago. What a journey it's been. Okay, this is not my correct slide deck. Oh, that's really annoying. Okay, anyway, we'll go back to that later. So definitely opened the wrong version of the slides. Oh well, this will be an adventure for all of us. So practice research voices. We will go back to definitions around practice research if you've not come across those as terms. So do bear with me, it is there soon. So the project was scoping a national practice research repository in the UK. Using the Haplo Archives repository we developed at Westminster that embedded practice research, primarily in art and design from the beginning. We aimed to look at moving to a repository's discoverability and interoperability landscape in which practice research disciplines are embedded rather than afterthought. Adam's already talked a bit about that. And very much bringing together the voices from the many interested communities. So each of these practice research disciplines have their own communities, and then we have all of the subject matter experts and specialists here at RDA, so metadata, persistent identifiers, all sorts of experts, research data managers, archivists who are interested in identifying what fair research and transparent research looks like. And we'll probably keep saying this today, but fair and transparent, which may be open, so not necessarily completely open, which respects all contributors and their intellectual property. So the team which I led was a collaboration between people like me, a librarian by background, although I was more research manager over the last 4 years, and Adam as a metadata specialist, and their academic colleagues. So Helen's a dance researcher, Neil's creative arts, and we've so we really did have a broader focus than just libraries and repositories. So building the foundation, we built this repository, and there's a link to that paper there. We've worked with JISC and then the British Library in their data site ownership role, or oversight role, to raise awareness that practice research outputs were not reflected adequately in the open standards landscape. This is really important because we had researchers in the UK asking for a web of arts, which was the equivalent to Clara Vate's Web of Science, which of course filled me with horror when I heard this, and it just made me think if we're going to do this, we need to enable open standards so that this data is not owned by commercial providers in the same way. So worked with Jessica and the British Library and the Prague UK reports. And I'll talk a bit about practice research in a minute, but these reports defined practice research and research narrative and made recommendations. So that gave us there's been a lot of discussion in the UK about what practice research is. So this was really important too. So practice research, so there are different flavors of practice research depending on your discipline. There's practice-led research, practice-based research, practice-informed research, practice as research, creative practice. So there's, depending on the discipline, there's slightly different perceptions around what practice research is. So what this does is it moves us from thinking about a non-traditional or a non-text output as this individual kind of random thing that just sits there, and it thinks about the fact that this research is connected. It's practice, it's process, it's not just end product. And what's interesting about that is that therefore practice research actually happens across all disciplines. So while we're primarily focusing at the moment on creative arts or creative practice disciplines, practice research happens in education, in health, and so is really interesting, I think, because it's something that we can learn from the arts and humanities that will benefit all. And this idea of research narrative will come back as we speak today, because that's also really important in terms of context. So features of non-traditional research outputs, then often, not always text, non-text. So these researchers do create text outputs as well. So it's not that they don't create journal articles and write books, but their non-text outputs are often their primary outputs. They change over time. They can include multiple files of different formats, which can be closed or open. Representation of performance or other live events, this idea of remediation. So for this community, once you document or remediate a live performance, it's a different thing. And that really matters to them. We had some interesting conversations around film and theatre, actually more theatre actually, and the National Theatre here does broadcast theatre, so you can watch it in cinemas, but to these researchers, that's a remediation. The research element can be embodied in the work, or it needs evidencing by narrative. Process is significant as product. It can be linear or non-linear, time-based, and equally as important, often involve a range of contributors that deserve acknowledgement and recognition. And that's something else I find really interesting about this, is that there's a lot of work going on in the UK around research culture, and actually really recognising and articulating, representing these contributors matters. So we aim to define technical and academic challenges of an open library practice research, which we wouldn't call it that now. Lots of lessons learned. We had 3 work streams, one around repositories, one around metadata and persistent identifiers, and one about that creating a practice research community of practice. And our kind of ethos was very much building on existing open source technology and open standards. So this is just a brief look at our community of practice. So as you can see, there's lots of individuals here in terms of librarians, repository managers, records managers, curators, archivists, research managers, impact managers. And then you've got entities or groups like the Digital Preservation Coalition and Research Data Alliance, digital preservation software communities, discipline communities like Royal Musical Association, practitioners, publishers, Australian Research Data Commons, DataCite, ORCID. So there's a very broad range, and there's communities of communities here, and each have their own culture. And I think that's really interesting and challenging because you're bringing together many, many different communities and their cultures and practices. So our findings and recommendations with a little sparkle. We had a sister project, as we'll call them, who took a more academic-led approach and did many, many interviews and focused very much, actually probably more so than we did, on skills and capacity, called Sustaining Practice Assets for Research, Knowledge, Learning and Education, led by the University of Leeds. So we have worked very closely with that team going forward. So our findings and recommendations, I've just realized what I did. I'm using my PowerPoint slides, not the Google Docs slides. That's why I've got the wrong slide deck anyway. That's just a brief aside. So ongoing community engagement is key. That idea of co-design. Platform needs to be interactive, that captures alongside the project, not retrospectively. So it's not just about dumping something in a repository at the end of a project, but actually engaging with that space throughout the research lifecycle. Embedded in community, respect form and function, enable discoverability, citation and preservation, recognize contributors, process and products. We talk a lot about beauty and the idea of a minimum lovable product rather than minimum viable products. But this work does need to be done and be underpinned by open standards, and there are many challenges. So certainly there's a big need for training as well across the piece, and investment in capacity, people and infrastructure. So what we did in the project is when we first built or developed that Haplo by co-use repository, we kind of assumed that a portfolio is just another word for a collection. But actually what we've learned through our work at Westminster, and particularly the work we did within PR Voices, is we asked this question around, is a collection, is a portfolio just a collection? So actually what we've identified as based on this work is that we need to capture those individual objects on an ongoing basis. We need to bring those together into a collection, and that a portfolio or theme builds on the idea of collection and overlays narrative and context. And narrative and context is really important, and that's why the RAIDs is a really useful identifier for this work. So what matters? Design and what it looks like, beauty and functionality. So we've said a bit of that already. Things like navigation, capturing, displaying process, digital preservation, more interactive image, video, audio, different output types, accessibility. So this is a very early look at the schema that we've been documenting based on the Haplo by co-use repository and this idea of portfolio, and then the idea of artifact, which is kind of a bog standard, if you want to call it, non-traditional output type, and then the idea of an exhibition or event. And that certainly, we started thinking it was exhibition, and by the end of the project, we've certainly come to the point where we realize it's much more an event output type, because those dates really matter. So we've got the idea of this non-text and text outputs, the event output type, collection portfolio. So really just saying what we said already. So, and I definitely apologies, this is definitely the wrong slide deck. Okay, so metadata and persistent identifier priorities. So we only had so much time. We had 6 months to get this project happening and completed. We would have done more work if we'd had more time. So unfortunately we didn't. We had to focus on these three, but these were the three most relevant. And these are the three that we feel there are active communities we can engage with. We had representatives from each community join us in a workshop. So we had Data Sites, Jez Cope from British Library join us, Natasha Simons from the ARDC recorded a piece for us on RAID, which is really exciting. I can't wait to hopefully do some work with that. And the credit taxonomy, thinking about those idea of contributor roles. So really how we work with these standards rather than create new ones. So I will definitely, actually, I think that the Google Doc is in the chat. So that's a more updated version, because I should be referencing the More Brains Cooperative for their institutional research management workflow. Apologies to Josh and Bill and Alice and Fiona for not having referenced that in this slide. What we tried to do here was look at this persistent identifiers workflow within institutional research management and actually identify what was missing. And so what practice research is missing at the moment, because this content isn't reflected in global standards. There are also a lot of assumptions made, and I think that's what's very useful about this slide. So for example, like I already referenced the credit roles being very STEM-based. We identified the need to reflect collaborators and participants. Collaborators practice research can be outside academia, so they might not have an ORCID. A DOI, an institution might not be the publisher, it might be a gallery, but they might want a DOI. Getting beyond the DOI being for data. Going back to that idea of fair not being equal to open. Evidence, the author or creator might be external, it might not be an internal person, and institutional repositories particularly expect an internal author or creator. Appropriate metadata is not being captured effectively, and all of the systems we use. I guess that's the other thing to remember, is that not all of this research is funded, so they're not covered by funder policy. And it's why in the UK, the research excellence framework policies are so relevant, because they apply to all researchers, not just those with grants. So going forward, this idea of co-design with community, with all communities, but we certainly see ourselves as a bridge to the discipline communities who really don't want the level of detail we need to work out as an RDA community about how we make this better. Embed practice research in open standards. I think Adam and I certainly joined a credits work event focus group, I think it was maybe a year, 18 months ago, where we were at least able to feed in some of the ideas we'd learned from our work. Need for more training across the piece in all communities, and investment in capacity, people and infrastructure. So I'm just going to skip back right to the beginning briefly. So this was the slide that was supposed to be last. Just a really useful quote to finish with from Stephen Hill, Director of Research at Research England. So this idea of being a new way of thinking about and engaging in research. So we need new structures and systems to maximize impact. So the infrastructure for communication and codification emerge with textual outputs in mind. Different approaches are needed to handle this richness and diversity. So it will benefit all research disciplines. I think that's a really nice place to finish. And yeah, I will add a link to the Google Doc version of the slides. Apologies in the chat.
I have just done.
Marvelous, thank you. And apologies, it took me a while to work out what had gone wrong there, because I was like, no, I've got something missing. Right, so do we need to go back to your slide deck?
Yeah, if you stop, and then what I'll do is I'll try and find it amongst the 60 million windows I have open. Yeah, that's that one. There you go. And you see only my slide window and not the horrific mess on there. So it's like, when you focus.
We can see all of your, right? You can see all of your tabs as well.
Yeah,
well, but that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I did very specifically that is a safe setting. Right. Okay. So that was the main bit of us talking at people. So Melroy, welcome. Good to see you here, man. Andrea, hello. So this is the bit where we're hoping that people open up their mics and share their experiences of working with, or you're right there, Melroy?
Yes, I'm here. Yeah, I just came to see what the session was about, and what I could learn, or at least take back with me, and try and convince the people who aren't convinced here in Australia as to what we can do about it. Alternatively, if they're already doing something about it, then let you know what it is that we're doing about it, and see if there's an opportunity to collab.
Yeah, we had so Tom Honeyman was signed up, but he's not turned up. But Tom was interested as well, so I don't know. But yeah, good to see. Do you want to just for the record introduce yourself properly, and then we'll see if Andrea's solved.
Oh yes.
Can you?
Hello.
Sorry, I know you and I could just chat for ages, but maybe it's probably.
Yes, no, that makes sense. Hello everyone, my name is Melroy. I work at the Australian Access Federation, which is kind of similar to what JISC does, but what I also do at the AAF is I lead the Australian ORCID Consortium. So I'm the lead for our Australian ORCID Consortium members, help them through their ORCID integrations, and a bunch of other ORCID related stuff, I guess is an easy way to put it. That's about it.
Amazing. And I one of the many reasons I got involved in this work was how do I sell ORCID to a creative practice researcher when their research doesn't easily fit into ORCID. So I think hopefully we have opportunity here to convince people that this work needs to happen.
Yes, so it is something I think ORCID have understood the need to get humanities and the arts researchers to actually put their research outputs into ORCID. However, there isn't a natural place for that to fit in, if you know what I mean, as in there isn't one that actually slots in properly with what ORCID already have, because there are so many different forms of research outputs specifically. One of the things I was hoping that with RAID, the ability to use RAID, especially with regards to practices, especially like a dance performance or a musical performance, being able to assign a rate to it, because it's a whole activity that has music in there, that has the dance and all of that sort of stuff, and then add that rate into the researcher's ORCID record. So it is then there as a piece that they can trace and they can look at if they need to verify what the provenance is around, who owns it, the different researchers who participated in that performance. I think it makes it much easier than what it is at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Laurie. Hey, Laurie. Yeah, and you've come in and you put yourself back on mute.
Hello, I'm late. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Okay, so all right, what you've missed is us talking about all of our stuff, and you've come in at the time where we were expecting you to talk about your stuff. So, come in for the worky bit. That's our stuff's boring anyway. Andrea, have you managed to fix your tech issues? If not, do you want to just type a quick hello in the chat, and we'll get to. Hold on, still not solved Turkish. Oh man, we totally feel your pain. Okay, so what if you would mind just spending a minute typing like where you are with non-text research and stuff, and what I'll do is while you're doing that, I'll speak to Laurie.
Oh.
Cool. All right, Laurie, hello. Thank you so much for coming along.
Yep.
So what we've done so far is talked a bit about kind of the things that we were hoping to get from the session. So I'll flick back to that. Right. So what we've done is we've shared a bit about the work we did in the UK. We talked a bit about kind of the co-design and I'm going to mute Melroy. There you go. Such a noisy boy. And so what we've done is talk a bit about the need to have like the very many different kinds of things, from practice research and the kind of non-text research output, research object stuff, as first-class citizens of the kind of like global research output space, right? And so this bit is the next bit, because this was to be a birds of a feather session, and what we want to do was kind of like introduce where we were coming from, and then talk to whoever turned up about kind of their thoughts on what they'd already done with non-text research objects, which other people have been calling nitros, and I'm really desperately trying to resist doing that. Hello, I can see the attraction. And then after that, we're going to think about, maybe some open standards, and Mari's just been talking about ORCID. You'll be shocked to hear. So this is all leading up to the framing bit, which is, do you have anything that you'd like to share about NTROs in the kind of, actually, sorry, again, this is a terrible thing whenever people are like, right, would you like to introduce yourself, Laurie, as well, please? Sorry, because
Yeah, sure. Yeah, my dogs are having fun back there too. Hopefully it's not too loud. So Laurie Hack. I am the CEO and founder of sorry, you can't hear them, but I can. CEO and founder of a consultancy called Mighty Red Barn. And as many probably my current role, I actually have had interactions with folks developing, I guess we'll call them nitros. One of the more recent ones is somebody, so I work with a lot of startups, folks that are trying to figure out, how can we provide infrastructure for research. One of the people I'm working with is developing developing images as a fair research object, right? So how can you have just a standalone image that would include what's presented in the paper or wherever, right? But really is itself almost a story, right? So it includes, for example, if you're presenting I'm a research biologist. And so if you're presenting something like a Western blot or something like this, when you're looking at a paper, it's usually presented this very flat image with a little text written below it and some methods that are incomprehensible. It's actually part of the metadata behind that image, so that if you clicked on it, you could see the original piece, what was cut out, how it was used to create that image. And on top of that, all of the information about what antibodies you used, what markers you used, all that is included and encapsulated in that image file itself. So as a researcher, you could use that image as a way to understand how is this experiment actually done. You would see the replicates, all of that other things, right? You could include research IDs, the sample IDs, whatever you wanted to do to make that an actual standalone fair research object. That I think is super, super interesting, making that happen. And then that standalone image becomes something that a researcher can say, hey, I was part of making this, and they can share with a publishing platform, a research repository, you name it, it's all there. So I think that's one thing to look at. I know folks have talked about things like data management plans. It's text-based, but not quite. It's not a paper, right? It's like, how are we doing the research? How do we think about storing our data? So I think that research data management plans are super important, and I think they should also become a standalone fair research object, right? And I know you've talked about artwork. Another project I'm working on is with local contexts, and what they're doing is trying to figure out how do we use things like labels and notices. So basically visual imagery and icons to help people understand what the indigenous data interests or indigenous interests are in cultural heritage objects, in even like genetic samples, rock samples taken from indigenous lands, all of that, using those visual tags as a way to provide that information for how can this thing, how should it be used, how should it be appreciated. So these are a lot of opportunities here, from in the weeds, how do we think about doing biomedical experiments and presenting those findings, to how do we think about intellectual property and indigenous data sovereignty as different ways of thinking about NITRO. So all of that stuff I'm working on. Yeah.
Fab. Thank you so much. Andrea, this is cool. This is the thing where everyone is struggling with some of the technology. I don't know who else has been having the yay. Okay, I'll read it out for the record. Andrew's from the World Data Systems International Technology Office. Howard's first RDA plenary, mostly going to learn, and my background is librarianship. I think you'll find there's a lot of respect and indeed former librarians here too. So, are you ever a former librarian, Jen, or is it?
I think, yeah, I thought so, but actually having spent 4 years in a research office and heading back to library and archives very soon, yeah, I don't think it ever leaves you.
Cool, thank you for that. Okay, so Andrew, we're going to assume that you're mostly got a watching brief, and please chip in on text when you need to. Laura, thank you for providing a ton of really interesting stuff to think about. Melroy, you've been here to think about kind of what to learn and also what to take back to Australian and potentially think about more context. So what I'm going to do now is shape this slightly differently from where we've got at the minute. And I'm going to move directly on with what we've got here to this next bit. Because what I think, that bit. Now, why would I do that, I wonder? So one of the things that we are really trying to think about in this space is around how we represent these things, how we characterize them. And Laurie, you put up a ton of really interesting kind of examples of where you are and where the things are from that. Now, from a long set of learning, we can describe everything in a repository, right? We can create the bestest repository in the world with hugely detailed schema, with wonderful taxonomies and vocabularies and everything, really structured and with space for folksonomic tagging and everything. And then what we actually have to do is talk about that in the rest of the world, in the kind of like wider infrastructure. So it's thinking about where there are opportunities or where there is already work and how to like push and advocate for that to ensure that the kind of like characteristics, the kind of things that we need for affordances in moving the kind of focus away from these terminal outputs. Not of course that they're dead. I had terminal exams in my first year, and I'd had this really kind of sense of dread coming in. Anyway, so the thing about like this kind of piece, which I think we can maybe spend a little bit more time on than we did in the first session, is about thinking about the kind of characteristics and stuff, thinking about the actual affordances that are there in the infrastructure already and what we might want to change or to encourage, and also like kind of the actual practice as well. So thinking about moving away from this kind of do lots of work and then eventually create something which is all wrapped up in a PDF, and how they are linked together as well. And the final bit of this, which we've only got so much time, so I'm going to try and keep that bit under wraps, is FAIR, of course, means about accessibility and interoperability. And there is the whole thing where when we talk about open science, a lot of the people who create these NTROs find that quite difficult because they don't necessarily want stuff to be open, and they don't often do science either. So we talk about kind of trying to encourage fair research as kind of a terminology for the wider kind of things. I'm waving my hands a lot, and I realize I'm really glad the camera's not actually on. And thinking about how we move that kind of like vocabulary, and it's partly an English language thing, okay? So French, Spanish, and so on. There's not the same kind of disparity between science and research. There's some differences as well, but in the kind of actual language you use. But it's very, in an English language context, it's kind of sciencey, STEMmy stuff, and then non-sciencey, arts, humanities, shape, etc. And it's about thinking about that kind of fair research as a way to kind of signify more inclusiveness. So what I'd start with is Milroy and then Laurie, if you want to like speak to any thoughts you have on that for a couple of minutes, and I'll keep an eye on time and wind us up when we need to. So Milroy, do you want to go first? And
I actually don't have anything to discuss about this. I'm more in the trying to gain more knowledge phase, I should say.
No worries, man.
So I have a use case that I can't be very specific about, but I can in general terms. And so a project recently came across my desk from an organization that will remain unnamed, and they have lots and lots and lots of different places and different forms of information that need to be grabbed together at an instant's notice to deal with various issues that come up, right? Like really serious issues that need to be addressed quickly. So, they've put out a question to the community, which says like, how do we do this? right? And so one answer, Adam, would be your answer or your comment about, can we create these super deep metadata rich repositories that all look the same in terms of their metadata spec so that we can interoperate between them? And this particular organization has said that is off the table. We are not do it that way. That we have to find some other way to get this information and talk to each other without adjusting the internal metadata spec, each of the different places that the information is stored, data information. And so one of the things that came up with this is what's been going on for years and years now in astronomy, where you have all these different places, different telescopes that are collecting information, and they develop their own methodology for collection and storage specifications for the data. And they were able to, in the astronomy field, work out a really light interoperability layer that allow these different facilities to communicate together about the data that they have stored without having to create a single, metadata schema that rules them all, right? And so I think we can get there, right? And I look at, for example, like what DataSite has, which is, it's not perfect, but none of this is ever going to be perfect, which is, I think it's 6, maybe 7 required fields that the site requires for all the stuff that comes through and gets a DOI registered. And I know it's not perfect, and I know it would be nice to have a lot more metadata, but those 6 metadata fields allow so much to happen. And so, you can say, we know this about the data. We're going to go over here to where the data are stored. And based on the metadata that are in that vertical, we can make some inferences about how this might interrupt with something else. And so I feel like a lot of the conversations about metadata schemas, super important, super relevant, also get us down the track of trying to find that one metadata schema instead of actually trying to figure out what that interoperability layer is and actually utilizing the data. And so that's my little spiel for the day. Is like you can tell I'm not a librarian, right? Is that I would like to find that really thin layer that allows us all to share the data, and then use tools that are specific for the use case to help us appreciate the data in the vertical, and then find ways to perhaps provide within each vertical a little bit more documentation about the data and the metadata schema in that vertical so that people coming there can understand how to utilize it.
Cool, thank you. So I think the really interesting about that is this kind of ability for a community to agree on a thing, right? And I think one of the things that in our work that was really important to do that as a co-design piece. And I think that part of the ways of working that, again, we make this work is ensuring that what we're doing is doing that all together. So we're not building a thing and then going to people and saying, hey, here's a thing, right? And that was, again, embedded in the kind of like culture and approach to the work that we've been doing, is that it's embedded co-design, right? You've got to actually say, what are the things here? And especially, so kind of like in our kind of practice, arts and humanities kind of thing, if you go and say, right, well, what we're going to do is going to work with the repository, and they go, sorry, okay, is that the thing where I put my thing when I don't want to do it, but because someone's given me some money, I have to? And it's like, yes, it's one of those. And it's, it's about finding the right kind of language and cultural dynamics, as well as, so it's, it's the whole socio-technical part of things, right? So it's not just, hey, we've got to fix this thing so that we've got machine actionable stuff and it's machine to machine. It's about making sure that the actual communities that we're serving with this are actually involved and can engage with it, right? Because part of the issues that we have is that we've had certain lenses applied to a lot of the infrastructure development. We've had a lot of STEM, we've had a lot of bio, partly because that's where the technology is, and partly because, that's where some of the funding and the kind of interest is. But I was talking to someone the other day, and, we're talking, so digital humanities have been dealing with like weirdly shaped corpus and scans of vellum and, you know, really old parchments and things like that, and building machine learning models and doing a lot of the things that people are now going, oh, wow, that's really cool. And, you know, they've been doing that for the past 20, 40 odd years. And no one has really recognized either this area of skill or this kind of like actual culture and way of work and practice.
Yeah.
And that's partly because there hasn't been a way, again, to put this as a kind of a first class thing in with everything else. So these kind of things, they end up on a website, they end up on an interactive experience, they end up as a data set or an Excel spreadsheet. And what they aren't is, you know, a thing that has the same kind of parity of esteem and is something that isn't just other inside the kind of wider global schema and metadata that we have. So I think there's an absolute need that you've identified there for that thing about finding agreement of a kind of a minimum lightweight inside a culture. But I think there's also some work done to push at the kind of edges of the kind of wider agreed shared taxonomies as well. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to be aware of when we're shaping kind of the direction of these things. You know, when we choose what taxonomies we're using for like item types and stuff, and you know, and to choose where we engage as well. Do we engage at that kind of sort of metadata advisory group stage as well, you know, as representatives of these cultures? Okay, so Jenny, do you want to have any kind of follow-up from that?
I guess also I think just thinking about the discipline communities is that they're not as necessarily comfortable with engaging, and I am a librarian, but I definitely have tried very hard to not overcomplicate our metadata. We've probably failed a little bit occasionally, but yeah, minimum, like it's just some of the fields we have in our repository are basically funder demanded rather than anything we want in there. But I mean, measurements, seriously, anyway. Measurements is a field in case we're submitting a physical object. So I think hopefully part of what we're trying to do in terms of building community here is giving that discipline community a chance to kind of those who are interested to engage more, and actually then we get them involved in the conversations as well. So they kind of have a say, because at the moment they just switch off. Like you try and also I think that's the other thing too, I guess, and Adam said a bit about this, but they care about what their research looks like, and so they won't put it in a repository, or they'll put it in like if they're forced, but there's no desire to do that. There's like, but this is going to make my research look terrible, so why would I do that? And I think that idea of focusing on one individual output without any context is how we find a way to, and that's where the RAID is looking like a really amazing opportunity to kind of reflect that changing work. And I guess, yeah, also just thinking about where, I think what's really interesting about this persistent identifier landscape is where you make the change. You know, do you make it in data sites, you make it in ORCIDs, like, you know, like, but also if you look at all of the taxonomies, like the lists are just so text output heavy. It's just, and also where non-traditional research outputs are listed, it's just like an add-on at the end. Yeah, I guess that's definitely starting to struggle with the time of the morning now rather than not even late night. Sorry, did that make sense?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to have my obligatory 2-minute rant on how we actually do this, and then I will go round other attendees. So one of the things that we found is that there are definitely willingness to engage at some level. As Jenny said, it's partly around kind of finding the right people and also, you know, describing that value and benefits, and partly about kind of the infrastructure, and, you know, one of the things that we've talked about a lot is ensuring that any kind of infrastructure we build to reflect these things has, like, actual beauty built into it. It's not a set of fields and forms that you use to submit something, but it's actually something that you would want to come to, that people have spent time thinking about the UI and the UX. People have spent time thinking about how we interact with stuff. So for that, some of the kind of wider thoughts and issues that we have are around kind of where the current set of technology and infrastructure sits, and how we kind of move that kind of cultural piece forwards. So for that, there are things like this, and that's why the next thing that we have is hold on, no, I'm not sharing. That's why, like, that's why I can see people. You think, I can see people. Yes, because I'm not actually sharing the thing. Right. So if I go back and just do this again, so that next idea, and hopefully that's just my slide now. As you can see, it's a very bold thing, and what it just says is action plan. And what I think we should do is just spend a moment in the Google Doc. So we're on session 2, and I've shared the link to it for everyone. And put 1 or 2 things from the discussion we've had so far you think would be concrete actions to move this kind of thing forward. And then we'll have like a brief discussion about that. And then the other thing that I'd like to do after that is have a little think about how we do that within the context of what we are today, which is about thinking about how we do stuff within actually kind of an RDA context or setting. And that's why I've also set up the kind of meeting on kind of creative and practice next week as well. But first of all, I'm just going to be quiet for 2 minutes, which will be painful, I promise you, but I will be actually quiet for 2 minutes. And just, if you could have a look in that doc, it's on the second section of notes. There's a bit that says action plan. If you want to stick 1 or 2 sentences in there, anything at all, and then we'll talk about it.
And I've just put the notes in the right place. Sorry, I had them in the first session. I've just realized I was.
It's horribly painful for me. And if you're not sure about action plans, in the first session, we had quite a few. So feel free to go and review those in that document as well. Have a quick look. Wait 1 more minute and then have a quick I realized I've been sharing that bit as we were talking. So I just go back up here. So this is the thing that we are doing now. Click on that bit. Okay, so thank you where you have contributed stuff. I'll go the other way around now. So Laurie, sorry, you've been speaking. Then we'll see what thoughts Melroy has. And if Andrea, if you want to put anything in chat, great. So Laurie, action that we can do now. I saw, are you an anonymous otter? And you're on mute.
There's too many moving parts for my brain. It's too late.
I know, man. I know. Trust us.
I'm like, I think the big one for me, and this is me again speaking from my like past 4 years of like working with startups. So many of these organizations that want to build bits of the research infrastructure open, they get stuck in building a new part of the publishing landscape, and I get irritated with that. And so my comment that I'm in the middle of commenting on is, whatever we do here, I want folks to not default to thinking about publications and the publishing platforms and journals as the be all end all for the RO part of this, right? There are so many other ways for sharing information than in a journal. I mean, let's keep that in mind as we're going through this. That's my pitch.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I think so one of the things we would say on the kind of like the journey to get where we are now is that we've been moving away from journal publication, although like Westminster has a press, but they also have, again, they're small enough, and Jenny can speak to this a bit more. They're small enough to be able to do interesting and imaginative things. To think about, more along the green route and more about kind of the way that you would use the better affordances in a repository that is aware of all of these things, and use that as an exemplar to push into the space, into this kind of like standards and taxonomy spaces to show and demonstrate what happens, again, in agreement with the wider standards community.
Yep.
Melroy, sorry, Laurie, did you want to have?
Nope, I'm done.
Cool, thank you. Melroy.
So for me, I mean, just based on what Laurie was saying, that you don't want everyone to think about the publication space, and I agree with that. However, the only reason I think people are thinking about the publication space is because the incentives are aligned towards it. So the incentive to get recognition mostly come if you've published something. And especially if it's in one of those really nice reputed journals, which can be gained. But that's a story for another day. But if we were to change, if we want NTROs to look at other avenues, then we need to also look at what are the incentives that are currently driving them towards looking at publications, and how do we change that so that they publish, as in they put it up where it is best for them, but at the same time, those outputs, as in, can be accessed, can be made fair to other researchers also, because I keep telling this every time, at least with ORCID, for us, it was, if our funders tell our members to jump, they will just ask how high, because at the end of the day, they are the ones that control the money. And it's the same for anything. It's the same for anything else. Is if there are incentives that are aligned towards a particular thing, that is what people will end up doing. And so if we could change those incentives, then I think we might be able to actually start seeing something actually happen in this space on a much larger basis, I guess.
Cool, thanks for that. So I'm going to paraphrase slightly, and what you're saying is that in order to demonstrate the value of the outputs and the things that have been created. So it's not so much about necessarily just the way that they're wrapped, presented, and so on, but about how that is working both in kind of what we would now hope to call responsible research assessment, right, rather than an H index or whatever, and how that kind of building of those affordances make those assessments and value judgments better. So I would respond to that with saying, so one of the things that we're doing with RAID and that we've seen with other kind of narrative and meta identifiers is to be able to package up some of these non-traditional research outputs. One of the things that Jenny touched on when we were talking about kind of the outputs from PR Voices was about the idea of the portfolio. And, a lot of the time we can see collections in repositories and they're basically buckets, right? It's the same thing that Figshare does. It's like, here's a soup and here's like a set inside the soup. So if you stick your net in and get some stuff out, and that's the thing. But that doesn't really tell you a lot about the intention. It doesn't tell you anything about like kind of the history and all the complexities of these things. So things like Rocrate and RAID and some of the other stuff that's going on at the moment allow you to attach like kind of the narrative to it. So I like to talk about RAID, for example, as a washing line, and you hang your various things on it. You hang the people that have been working on it, the places they've been working, the funding they get from, the data, the workshop, the events, the performances, and all of that on it. You use things like credit, but credit that actually is fit for purpose. And again, I'm not going into more of that right now, but you use things like that to understand the like contributorship, and you use things like ORCID because again, we have things like GDPR and so on, which means that to actually attach an individual to this, and this is something that we talked about in the other session, that's quite tricky. But one of the reasons we have, like, a personal persistent identifier that allows you to control yourself how much information is shared and interacted with, is to allow that kind of like one-step abstraction and proxying of your information while still giving you transparency and control over it. And by doing all of these things, what we do is we allow that assessment and value to be exposed, and we allow impact to be further demonstrated and made more transparent and open and available as well. And I am going to use the word open there because, one of the things you can do with something that is connecting all of these things together is you can say to the people who are creating the infrastructure, who are serving the data sets, who are doing these things at the start, if you create this RAID and then you hang all the things together on it, you can then track the impact of your large collider, your data set. You can pull all of these things together because instead of being in a codicil in an acknowledgement, you are part of the actual chain, and the provenance issues become simpler. They don't become like non-existent, but become simpler, right? And then it's also a way that we can contribute to the wider information space in that global space as well, because we are explicitly expressing connections and relationships that before would have to be implicitly derived from graphs and edges and nodes and relationships as well. So all of this, yeah, slightly more than a 2-minute run, but all of this allows us to connect and increase the value of these objects in a way that we couldn't necessarily do just by characterizing them and capturing them as well. So a portfolio where you have a shaped and structured narrative and set of connections and relationships allows you to do that in a way that a collection doesn't. And there are, lots of different ways of expressing those kind of collection stuff. I think currently RAID is a good potential candidate for that. Just as an aside, which I think I can't share too widely, but I think it's going to end up in an ORCID record, not as an item, but as a professional activity. So it'll be like the actual kind of activity, the project will be the thing that's kind of recorded and your interaction with that. So I think, that makes sense in that it's difficult to kind of think of it as a particular item or output. But what it does do is it allows, again, to shape those relationships and stuff. From a point of view of concrete action at that point, then there's also that idea of tying these things up together to allow both the value to become more apparent, but also to use that as a method of engagement. I'm not sure who put in the thing about the international interaction thing. Or is that you again, or Melroy?
Nope.
Might have been
Andrea,
me.
thank you. Oh, it might have been you. Was it you, Jenny? Sorry.
Possibly.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, no, it'd been you. And I think that's another thing as well, right? Is one of the things that we're really trying to figure out now is where we go to talk about these things, right? So obviously here is a really important place to talk about the kind of data and the way that we manage and shape that, and plug into the various communities that are doing this already. But then where else do we go as well? And so again, the reason for these birds of a feathers is to try and plug into the wider knowledge community. So if anyone here has suggestions for that non-RDA space that we might talk about things, please either speak up and or put them in the action plan. So kind of places for engagement.
See, I was thinking for this to actually, right now it is just those who are already converted that we're preaching to, or those who are on the path of that conversion. However, to actually see a lot of movement happening, it makes a lot more sense to involve those organizations like your funding bodies or even the universities, organizations that actually award positions or money or whatever it is, or grants to researchers based on these sort of outputs. They need to come out and say, look, this is what we're looking at, and this is the way we see this happening, and this is what we would like to do. We would like you as researchers to do, and we want you to do your NTROs that way. And what that means is then there'll be a lot more appetite for people to do it. Because if there is no incentive aligned to it, and it's just because, yes, it makes it fair, and yes, you can reproduce it, and yes, you can do all of that sort of stuff, but you're not going to have it on a much global scale. It's always going to be local. It's going to be among those small pockets of people who are already convinced that you need to do this sort of stuff. But to make it more mainstream, I think we need to get those that actually award or those that incentivize researchers to actually do that. So start incentivizing, or get them to consider incentivizing researchers, or even organizations for that matter, to do it in the way that we've been discussing. That is assuming we want to do it in a mainstream sort of way and not just a niche sort of thing.
I think it's a really interesting question and point, Milroy. Thank you. I think a couple of things. So what we find in the UK is that actually often this research isn't funded. It doesn't actually have a funder. So that's tricky, and that's why our research excellence framework is actually helpful in many ways, because it does actually recognize this kind of research. And but REF is as we call it, is institutional. It's not about individual researchers. So we're kind of wrestling with that at the moment, because we need to incentivize individual researchers to document and share their work, and that we need to make it easier for them to do that, because at the moment it's too hard and they need help, and so all of the people in the ecosystem need the skills. So it's I mean, I have to say UK funders are recognizing this, and we are slowly gaining traction, which is great. But I think hopefully if we can show what we're doing in the UK, maybe other international bodies will follow. I just also wanted to flag COARA, and I think I'm going to get this right, the Coalition on Advancing Research Assessment, I think is what it stands for. But COARA is definitely gaining traction, or gained a lot of traction in the UK. I don't know how far it's gone beyond the UK and Europe, but they have now just they've set up, I think, or in the process of setting up and evaluating social sciences and humanities research globally. And I think there's an opportunity here to make sure that any work that happens in that space isn't yet again, because the danger at the moment is that what will happen is it will assume text-based outputs in the arts and humanities are what they're talking about. Going back to your point, Laurie, about publishing, knowing that what part of the reason Adam and I have been working on this for the last few years is like all of these changes are happening and they're just based on what's already there rather than embedding this thinking.
Yep.
Fabulous. Thank you all so much.
There you go.
Right.
It was my little soapbox.
There you go. Okay. Next steps. This is nearly near the end, and Jenny and I are falling off. So, oh dear. Right. This thing where it's, the RDA has decided that it's from 8 a.m. Well, this is BST obviously, but it's 8 a.m. till 1 a.m. It's a whole thing, right? Yeah. Anyway. Okay. So, thoughts on next steps within the RDA. So, one of the reasons that, again, we ran these bottles is to think about who and where and what and how much interest there would be in doing something semi-formal. And again, there's the meetup. I've just put a poll in to see if people would like a second one of those, which wouldn't be necessarily this late, but because I want to try and avoid these slots, but maybe just before this slot, or maybe just after, depending. On what do we think about what the RDA currently does with data, and with that kind of culture piece around acknowledging the discipline specific and the non-text and this kind of thing. So do we need to think about either an interest group, which is probably more likely, I think, than thinking about some kind of core work packages? There's the community of practice. I don't think we're quite as well formed to do that for something as specific as the NTROs. Maybe, it might be something that when we talk about kind of general, more arts humanity shape, that community of practicing might be more valid. But, from other people's perspectives of working within the RDA framework, what do we think the kind of next steps would be?
So, Adam, I'm wondering how practical you want to be.
Very.
Part of me says, wouldn't it be awesome if we could just focus on one research output, just one, and then use this time at RDA to come up with a practical use case and gather both the people who make those research outputs and also the organizations that would enable their sharing, whether that's a collections management system or whatever, and detail out what such a sharing methodology would look like and the associated kind of, steps for making that happen. So the output would be a really specific thing for, a painting. I'm just throwing that out there, right? So we could do that, and I feel like that would be a focused activity that would get somewhere and would be able to say, okay, here's one example of how this can be done. And now this process can be used for other research objects. And I think, Melroy, to your point about people really pay attention to publications, because that's where in academia, a lot of work is, that's where people look. It's, the the light of post. So I don't know. That would be my thought, is just to pick one research output and have this group focus on that.
Thank you very much, Melroy. And again, Andrea, you're welcome to contribute in chat or through the medium of sign. I don't know. Sorry, but Melroy.
I was just saying. I agree with what Laurie is saying, and it makes sense to actually focus on one bit so that there is something tangible that can then be taken back to the community and said, look, this is what we're saying, this is what we think should be done, this is how it should.
Yeah. Okay, man, thank you.
It starts getting that movement
Okay, Mel, you might have just broken up a little bit at the end. I'm not sure if you. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Which bit didn't you hear?
So got up to yeah, it's a good idea to focus on this on one kind of thing. That makes sense. And then I think it might be of another 15, 20 seconds.
So what I was saying is by focusing on that one thing, we can then take it to the community and start getting a lot more movement then happening over there, and then get them further interested in supporting other work packages or other artifacts gradually. So it shows that there is something substantial to work for, and this is just one of those many outputs, and we can do more, but obviously we need the community support in doing that.
Okay, and I think that makes sense, partly recognizing the kind of unique way of RDA being more or less a volunteer, although there's support from things like Tiger now, but it's not anyone's full-time job to work on this stuff, right? In kind of like the RDA groups and working groups and stuff. So having a kind of a tight focus on one thing allows for gathering of a useful set of people, perhaps. Do I mean useful? It's probably the wrong word. I probably mean something more like engaged or interested. But pragmatically, people who actually do stuff. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So we're pretty much at time. I'm just checking the chat, and okay, Andrew, you've made it all the way to the end, so well done. So the last slide is, thank you. So what we're going to do is, if you have more things to put in the notes, please put them in the notes. Especially the one thing I haven't asked about, but if you can think of, with your engagement with RDA up to now, if you think there are other kind of working groups or interest groups we should reach out to, and I've obviously got quite a few that I could think of myself, but we're just trying to kind of get as much of a sense of information and ideas from everyone else. So if you think there are other RDA working groups, interest groups, or approaches, and pardon me, so on, that would be great to add that, as well as kind of like the wider idea too. That is Jenny and my contacts, and the PR Voices had a Twitter, now X, account, which has some fantastic stuff in it, including, if you look down at the bottom of the collaborative notes, we've got a set of outputs, and that includes the final report as well. So, again, I always recommend people read our report because it's brilliant. It doesn't quite cover everything, because we had 6 months, and we didn't know we had 6 months until about a month before the 6 months. But anyway, the joy of funding. So thank you. Jenny, do you want to?
Absolutely. A huge thank you, everyone. We really appreciate your engagement, and hopefully we'll be working with you going forwards. That's why we're here. So yeah, really, really appreciate your feedback. We do have a blog as well with loads of content on it. So that I think
that's at the bottom of the doc as well.
Yeah. So that links to all our presentations and outputs and things too.
Yeah.
So Adam and I have been busy. My priority now is funding, and Adam's is more conferences, I think. But we do have PidFest and Daria EU to come in the coming weeks, so more conversations ahead.
Yeah, I guess if any of you are at PidFest, then we'll be doing some of this again in the lightning talks, and we'll also be thinking about trying to get a slot in the unconference as well, to again work on this kind of space around the kind of standards and how we figure out the representation, and how we push into kind of like the schemas, the metadata, and the systems and infrastructure. So that we'll be at PidFest for a while. Be you there if you're there.
I'll be there. See you guys.
Fabulous.
Cool. We get to meet you in person. Yay.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn everything off in a second. So thank you and goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. And thanks, Adam, for
Thank
all
you,
your
everyone. Bye-bye.
sharing. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, no worries. And thank you, Andrew. Okay, thanks, bye.